And now for some additional comments on the economy, we turn to Segall, who is joining us remotely. Morris?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Well, our view on the economy parallels a good bit of what you just heard from Claire, although not completely. We presented back in December, as Jim mentioned, and our forecast for the economy at that time and for non-residential construction was quite bearish. And as we have gone through the first quarter into the second, our fears in regards to economic contraction and the recession, have been borne out. We felt, and we were bearish on the economy and the cycle relatively early, going back to 2006. But as we got through the fourth quarter of 2008, we felt that at the rate of contraction we were seeing, that we were likely going to see a bottoming in the recession around the time of the first quarter. We did not feel the economy was going to contract at a 5% linked rate or a 20% annual rate for much more than a couple of quarters. We continue to feel that way. We think that the first quarter, which we think will be revised to about a 5% contraction from a 6% first cut rate, is going to be probably the low point in the cycle. Unfortunately, what we see going forward is more of an L-shaped type of scenario for the remainder of this year, maybe into the very first quarter of 2010. And the reason that we see that is because we are not seeing the kind of follow-through of some of the early, pardon the expression because I think it's overused, green shoots that we saw in March. Some pickup in industrial production, some pickup in sales, etc., that were buoyant and were giving us some optimism that the recession indeed had bottomed or ended, and we were on our way to some sort of recovery. Those numbers have not been borne out by the numbers we're seeing here in the month of May for April. Retail sales were surprisingly weak. Industrial production was surprisingly down again. Inventory to sales ratios jumped up again. So what we've seen happening, and we have felt this, is that while we hit a bottom possibly in the cycle in the first quarter, we think we're going to lay along that bottom through the second and third quarter. One of the new factors that has made us a little bit more bearish and has forced us to move our forecast for second and third quarter GDP from sort of a flat line to a negative of maybe 2 or 3% is that this new downsizing of General Motors and Chrysler is now going to disgorge at least 100 to possibly 300,000 additional workers from the automobile manufacturing plants to the parts suppliers to the dealerships. And those numbers, those unemployment numbers are going to hit over the summer. And I agree with Claire that we were starting to see an improvement in first-time unemployment claims roughly from around the beginning or middle of February all the way through March and into April. We are fearful that that trend is going to reverse as we go through the summer, given the new round of unemployment that we're expecting out of Detroit. We also see where American Express just announced that they're laying off 4,000 people. So the unemployment situation continues to be so-called an anvil on top of this economy, which is suppressing consumer demand, it's suppressing consumer sentiment, although consumer sentiment has risen we see an L-shaped type of economic pattern for the remainder of this year. We do see an economic recovery starting to percolate gradually early next year and then building through 2010 and then accelerating through 2011 and 12. A similar pattern to what we saw in 2003 and 4 after the recession of 2001 and 2. We believe that the recovery could be quite robust, and that does fly in the face of some conventional wisdom because there is enormous pent-up consumer and business demand that is being sidelined through this last 12 to 18 months as a result of this recession and unemployment and the suppression of spending. So we think that once we can start to turn the corner and we start to absorb the enormous amount of laid-off workers and with the increased liquidity and better creditworthiness of the consumer as he's paying his debt down and he's raising his savings rate, that a lot of the deferred spending that we've been seeing in 2007 and particularly 2008 and this year are going to start to manifest itself in pretty robust recoveries in beginning the second half of 2008 as it gains momentum running through 2011 and 12. That is clearly going to stimulate overseas economies which are in far worse shape than the U.S. economy since they are primarily export dependent. So as the U.S. economy reflates, we are going to bring the rest of the world along with us as we import more and stimulate the export orientation of these foreign economies. I agree very wholeheartedly with Claire. We have been bullish on the stock market for some time, but we have cautioned people, even going back to late last year, the stocks were very statistically cheap, but you must have 1 to 3 year time horizons. It wasn't a situation where you were going to be able to jump in the market either in Q4 or Q1 and make a tremendous amount of money in calendar 2009. As it turns out, and we concur with the previous remarks, we believe that the cycle bottoms for this market have already been hit in the early March period. We think you've had an enormous recovery